Right now, on Earth, there is exactly one human species, just us. But for almost all of human history, that was not true. For hundreds of thousands of years, multiple human species walked the planet at the same time, sometimes on the same continent, sometimes in the same valley, and sometimes, if the DNA is right, in the same bed. Stick around because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how many of our cousins were out there, why they disappeared, and why a piece of them is still living inside you. Picture Europe and Asia around 100,000 years ago. Thick forests, open grasslands, ice creeping down from the north. In this world, a stocky, heavily muscled species called the Neanderthals hunted mammoths with wooden spears and lived in tight family groups inside caves and rock shelters. Meanwhile, in Africa, a taller, leaner species was slowly spreading out of the continent. That species was us, Homo sapiens. Head east, and the picture gets even stranger. On the island of Flores, small enough humans stood barely taller than a modern kindergartner. In Siberia, a shadowy group we barely understand, left behind nothing but a finger bone and a couple of teeth. Further inland, in parts of Asia, older, more ancient-looking humans were still hanging on, doing things basically the same way their ancestors had for a million years. We were not alone, and we were not even the only ones spreading. This was not one lonely human story. It was several stories happening at once on different continents, sometimes crossing paths, and honestly, most people have no idea any of this happened. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone. Scientists now count at least 6 and possibly 9 distinct human species that were alive at the same time within the last 300,000 years. That includes Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus clinging on in parts of Asia, the tiny Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in Indonesia. Nicknamed the Hobbit because adults stood barely over 3 feet tall, and Homo naledi, discovered in a South African cave system so narrow that researchers had to be small enough to squeeze through it. For a long stretch, roughly between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago, at least 4 of these species were alive on Earth simultaneously. Humanity was not a solo act, it was a crowded stage. You might be wondering how we can possibly know any of this. It is not guesswork. Scientists date fossils using techniques like radiocarbon dating for anything under about 50,000 years old, and other methods like uranium series dating for anything older than that. Layers of volcanic ash and sediment above and below a fossil act almost like a calendar, letting researchers pin down roughly when a bone was buried. When you line up all of those dates from sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, you get overlapping timelines. Neanderthal bones from one region date to the same window as Sapiens bones from another region a few hundred miles away. That overlap is the proof. These were not species that politely took turns, they shared the calendar. So why did this happen? Why didn't evolution just produce one human species and stop there? The first big reason is geography. Early human ancestors kept leaving Africa in waves over hundreds of thousands of years, and each wave got cut off in a different place. A group that ended up in the cold forests of Europe faced completely different pressures than a group stuck on a small island in Indonesia. Think of it like sending several teams into different escape rooms with different obstacles. Each team solves the puzzle in its own way. Isolation plus different environments equals different bodies, different brains, different survival strategies. That is evolution working the same basic material into several different shapes at once. The second reason is time. Evolution is slow, but human migration was messy and repeated. Groups left Africa, adapted, and sometimes a later wave of humans left again and found older cousins already settled somewhere. That is exactly what seems to have happened with Neanderthals. Their ancestors left Africa long before ours did, adapted to cold Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, growing shorter limbs and barrel chests to conserve heat, while sapiens were still evolving separately back in Africa. By the time our ancestors caught up and moved into Europe, Neanderthals were already the locals. 2 branches of the same family tree, grown far apart, then suddenly reintroduced to each other. And that reintroduction is where things get genuinely wild. When Homo sapiens moved into Neanderthal territory, they did not just compete for food and shelter, they had children together. We know this because scientists have sequenced Neanderthal DNA from fossil bones and compared it to living humans today. The result, most people with ancestry outside of Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. That is not a metaphor. It is sitting in your genome right now, affecting things like your immune system and even how your skin reacts to sunlight. A similar story happened with the Denisovans, a mysterious species known mostly from a single finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave, whose DNA shows up heavily in populations across parts of Asia and the Pacific Islands, including some groups where it makes up several percent of their entire ancestry. Think about how strange that actually is. This means, somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, an actual sapiens and an actual Neanderthal met. And instead of running away or fighting, they started a family. That happened often enough, across enough generations, that the genetic fingerprint survived tens of thousands of years and is still detectable in laboratories today. It also means the old idea of one clean human family tree with neat separate branches is basically wrong. The real picture looks more like a tangled root system, with branches crossing back into each other again and again before finally thinning down to the single trunk we have today. Now compare that crowded ancient world to today. Right now, there is one human species left, spread across every continent, urban and rural, connected by phones and airplanes instead of migration routes and cave paintings. What changed? Part of it is simple math. Small, isolated populations are fragile. A volcanic eruption, a disease, a sudden climate shift, any of these could wipe out a group of a few thousand individuals in a way it never could to a global population in the billions. Neanderthals likely died out around 40,000 years ago from a mix of shrinking populations, climate swings, and competition with the more numerous, more widespread sapiens moving into their territory. The Hobbits of Flores vanished not long after modern humans reached their island. Homo erectus, the longest surviving human species in history at nearly 2 million years, finally faded out in Indonesia. One by one, the branches thinned until only ours was left standing. Here is where most people get the picture wrong, and it is worth clearing up. Neanderthals are almost always shown in movies as dumb, hunched brutes grunting around a fire. That image is basically ancient propaganda, and it is not accurate. Neanderthals made tools, controlled fire, buried their dead with apparent ritual, and there is real evidence they used pigments and jewelry, meaning they may have decorated themselves or created symbolic art. Their brains, on average, were actually slightly larger than ours. They were not a failed rough draft of humanity. They were a fully successful species that thrived in brutal Ice Age conditions for over 300,000 years, longer than Homo sapiens has existed so far. They did not lose because they were stupid. They lost because they were fewer and because the world around them kept getting harder to survive in. And the myth correction does not stop with Neanderthals. The Hobbits of Flores were not simply small versions of us, sick or malnourished, as some early skeptics claimed. Their skeletons show a completely different body plan, including wrists and shoulders that look more like much older, more primitive ancestors, suggesting they evolved their tiny size independently, in isolation over hundreds of thousands of years on that one island. And Homo naledi might be the strangest twist of all. Despite having a brain roughly one-third the size of ours, evidence from their cave system hints that they may have deliberately placed their dead deep underground, in total darkness, a behavior scientists once assumed required a large, modern brain. If that holds up, it means brain size alone was never the full story of what made a species capable of complex behavior. So let's bring this all together. For most of human history, being human was not a solo experience. Multiple species evolved in parallel, shaped by isolated environments, then collided through migration, sometimes competing, sometimes interbreeding, and eventually leaving only one branch standing, us. Our species spent the vast majority of its existence sharing the planet with close relatives, not standing alone at the top of some evolutionary ladder. What that shows is that evolution does not aim for a single perfect outcome. It throws out several experiments at once and lets circumstances decide which ones survive. We are not the inevitable endpoint of human evolution. We are simply the branch that happened to make it through. And that is a very different and honestly a much more humbling story than the one most of us grew up believing. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If Neanderthals had a larger population, a bit more luck with climate, or simply more time, would you be reading this in a world with two human species instead of one? Would we be trading, fighting, or maybe even marrying into a completely different branch of humanity right now? Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this kind of deep dive into where we actually came from fascinates you, subscribe, because next time we are going even further back to the very first moment something in Africa stood up and started walking like us.